Let me begin my formal introduction. First, I want to welcome you all here. I am Dennis Longmire, chair of the committee that oversees the College of Criminal Justice's Distinguished Lecture Series. And before we get started, if everyone will please remember to silence all of your electronic devices, and please make sure that if you do need to get up in the middle of the lecture, to try to do so in a non-disruptive process. I'm also going to ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of Dr. Braithwaite's presentation, unless he overrides this request. It's his presentation. And also, given the nature of the auditorium, when you do ask questions at the end, please stand and shout them out very loudly. And Dr. Braithwaite, I'd like to ask you to restate the question before you answer it, because this is being videoed, it is being recorded, and sometimes those of you who've watched some of the previous videos recognize that the questions aren't necessarily clearly understood, so sometimes the question-answer session on the videos becomes a little bit disjointed. Also, remember that immediately following the formal lecture, doctoral students are invited to join Dr. Braithwaite for an informal colloquium that will be held in the Texas Room, and it will then be followed by lunch. And so all of the doctoral students are invited to join us for lunch. I'm not sure how it's going to work, but there is a sign-up sheet there. My suspicion is it will be better for us to get the meal from the lunch place and then go back to the Texas Room to eat it, rather than trying to find seats in the actual C-Java. My formal role this morning is to welcome you on behalf of the College of Criminal Justice's faculty, dean, and other distinguished members of the college, and to introduce today's Beto Chair lecturer, Dr. John Braithwaite, who is here with us from the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific. I will more formally introduce him to you following a few more brief housekeeping notes. This is the fourth and final Beto Chair lecture being presented this academic year, and will be followed by 2 lectures in the fall and 2 lectures in the spring next year. I can now announce that one of the lectures, probably the first lecture in the fall, will be Charles Tittle, the author, of course, and well-known theorist who's from North Carolina State University. Control balance theory should ring a bell. The committee is actively working to complete the list of lectures for next year, and appropriate announcements will be made at the appropriate time. The Beto Chair Lecture Series was originated in 1981 when the university received an endowment from the Jesse H. Jones and Mary Gibbs Jones Endowment, also known as the Houston Endowment Corporation. The purpose of the gift was to help enrich the educational experiences of the College of Criminal Justice's doctoral students by bringing leading figures in our discipline to the campus. It was named in honor of Dr. George J. Beto, former director of the Texas Department of Corrections and distinguished professor of criminal justice at Sam Houston State University from 1972 until 1992. Today, we are proud to add John Braithwaite's name to the list of distinguished visitors. Since its inception, the Distinguished Lecture Series has enjoyed visits by over 75 academic researchers and scholars, including such notables as Leslie Wilkins, Niels Christie, Meta Chesney Lind, and Doris McKenzie. There are video broadcasts of some of these available, and so if I recommend that you view them at your leisure, going to the Criminal Justice Center's website. Dr. Braithwaite completed his bachelor's degree in psychology with honorable recognition in studies in anthropology and sociology from the University of Queensland in Australia, where he then went on to finish his PhD degree in sociology. He then accepted a position at Australia's Griffith University, where he worked his way through the ranks of part-time tutor and lecturer to senior lecturer before returning to the University of Queensland as a lecturer. A year later, he accepted a Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship and visiting lecturer's position at the University of California, Irvine's program in social ecology. Upon his return to Australia, he worked as a criminologist with the Australian Institute of Criminology, director of the Australian Federation of Consumer Organizations and a senior research fellow in sociology at the Australian National University's Research School of Social Sciences. He spent 7 years as a visiting fellow with the American Bar Foundation before returning to Australia, where he currently holds his second prestigious Australian Research Council Federation Fellowship. Dr. Braithwaite lists 30 awards and honors he has received during his career, including recognition as a fellow with the Institute of Financial Crime Prevention in the United States, receipt of the Donald R. Cressy Award from the Society of Certified Fraud Examiners, whose headquarters are located in Austin, Texas, where they also named a building after him. He also received the American Society of Criminology's Michael J. Hindelang Award, the Celine Gluck Award, and their Sutherland Prize for research contributing to American criminology. In 2006, Cambridge University's Frederick Lozelle and Dr. Braithwaite were the first recipients of the most prestigious Stockholm Prize in Criminology. Dr. Braithwaite's work in the area of reintegrative shaming and responsive regulation were among the reasons mentioned by the selection committee when they announced him as one of the recipients. His vita also shows that during that same year, he was installed as a chief in the Nabwan clan in Papua New Guinea. We have a chief amongst us, not unlike Sam Houston. Dr. Braithwaite is by far one of the most widely cited scholars working in the field of criminology today. He has published over 20 influential books, over 150 scholarly articles appearing in virtually every major journal published in our field, including Criminology, Justice Quarterly, Theoretical Criminology, the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, and Criminology and Public Policy. His work spans topics ranging from restorative justice, white-collar and corporate crime, the effect of income inequality and social democracy on homicide rates, the regulation of nursing homes and elder care facilities. He has excelled to positions of leadership and received international recognition for everything he has done, and we are privileged to have him joining us today. Please join me in welcoming today's distinguished Beto Chair Lecturer, Dr. John Braithwaite.
Thanks, Dennis, for that very kind introduction. It is a great honour to be here to present the Beto Chair Lecture, following upon so many distinguished scholars who have come before me. And it's lovely to be here at Sam Houston State University, where I must say you have such a distinguished group of faculty, something I've known for a long time, but during the last 2 days I've also come to learn how many wonderful students you have at this fine institution who've been challenging me with some very difficult questions in the interesting conversations we've been able to have so far during my visit. I'd particularly like to say what an admirer I am of Dennis Longmire. You know, universities are very important institutions. As we see what's going on in places like Egypt and many other countries in the Middle East, in Tunisia, where the current ferment started there, university campuses are where the ferment of ideas has been, driven a lot of that activity, the courageous activists who step forward to promote social change. That's a very important function of universities. We want universities to be places that are politically alive, where people stand up for their views. It doesn't matter that we don't always agree with the views that they have, and in that sense, that's the sense, and well, there are many senses in which I'm an admirer of Dennis, but here's the compassionate strength he shows in his vigils after every execution that occurs here in Huntsville is internationally well known, and one of those other things that puts Sam Houston State University on the map in a way that, by my lights, goes to that political exchange, which is an important part of why universities lead change in the world. Well, today I'm going to be talking about corporate crime in the pharmaceutical industry. I published a book on this in 1984, and at the moment, under the leadership of my co-authors, Graham Dukes and James Maloney, we're producing not quite an updated version, but a rethinking of that 1984 books. The senior author, Graham Dukes, is someone who was a senior executive of one of the world's, the medical director of one of the world's major pharmaceutical multinationals, was also a director of pharmaceuticals for the World Health Organization, and was the head of the Dutch pharmaceuticals regulatory organisation. So this time we'll have some genuine competence on board about how the pharmaceutical industry works. But back to the research I did between 1978 and 1980, when I was on that postdoc at the University of California at Irvine. I interviewed 131 pharmaceutical executives in many countries, including this one. One of the things that I found from records at the Securities and Exchange Commission, among other places, was that 19 of the 20 largest US pharmaceutical corporations had admitted to paying bribes to advance its commercial purposes during that decade of the 1970s. This was part of the Lockheed foreign bribery scandal unfolding. And what unfolded after Lockheed was the revelation that it was the pharmaceutical industry who had the worst record of foreign bribery, and they were bribing all sorts of people. They were bribing hospital administrators to persuade them to buy their drugs. They were bribing health ministers to get them to approve their drug for marketing, and many other doctors and many other players in affecting their interests. Today, there is still that problem of bribery in the international pharmaceutical industry, and still at very high levels. Indeed, just in the past few years, we've seen the heads of two of the largest pharmaceutical regulatory authorities in the world convicted of corruption. The heads of pharmaceutical regulations for China and for the European Union. So this is a problem that's still with us today. There was a chapter in that book on fraud in the safety testing of drugs, and we documented many cases where new drugs were being tested on monkeys, for example. The monkeys would go blind and be replaced with monkeys that could see. There were other studies, famously by the GD Searle company based in Illinois, where many rats died and were replaced during the experiment with live rats, reincarnated rats. Interestingly, the chief executive officer of GD Searle during the 1970s was none other than Donald Rumsfeld, a gentleman with an interesting record in all sorts of ways throughout his career. he also did some positive things, it's got to be said, in dealing with some of the problems responding to some of the problems that company had during the 1970s. But individual doctors were involved. 62 doctors who were from this country, 62 from this country alone, and we had many in my own country, Australia, professors of pharmacology from some of our greatest universities in Australia. And these 62 doctors in the United States whose involvement in fraud in the safety testing of drugs was documented in corporate crime in the pharmaceutical industries. Some of them had interesting stories. There were physicians who'd been the subject of terrible misfortunes on the eve of Food and Drug Administration investigations into the quality of the data they'd collected for the submission to the agency in support of new drug applications. Dr. James Scheiner, an orthopaedic surgeon of Fairfax, Virginia, who'd done several experiments for Johnson & Johnson, had his office vandalised the night before the FDA audit of his raw data. The mindless vandals dumped all of the records relating to the studies to be audited into a whirlpool bath. Just before his next scheduled FDA audit, Dr. Scheiner had a fire in his office. And the night before that, the inspection had been rescheduled. Dr. Scheiner was viciously mugged before that rescheduled audit by an assailant who wielded a paperweight from his office. Another doctor, Francois Savory, who had earned a fortune testing experimental drugs for Hoffmann La Roche and other leading companies, suffered the misfortune of accidentally dropping his data overboard while out in a rowboat. A US court didn't believe him. He was sentenced to 5 years probation for felony fraud. And this continues today as well. Just last year, Scott Rubin, a professor at Tufts University in this country, was convicted to a sentence of 6 months imprisonment regarding a pattern of fraud. And his fraud was pretty simple. You know, he completely made up his data and submitted it in applications for approval of new drugs. A lot of this work was done for the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, the Pfizer Corporation, with its headquarters in New York. Dr. Rubin was employed as a speaker for the Pfizer Corporation. He would lobby the Food and Drug Administration on behalf of the approval of the drugs on which he had allegedly done his research in support of those new drug applications. But he also was involved in fraudulent manipulation of data that he'd collected for the Merck Corporation and a number of others, including research on Vioxx, which is a product now withdrawn from the market, associated with 25,000 deaths worldwide. Dr. Rubin has had his data withdrawn from 21 journals, 21 leading journals, that is to say, have withdrawn those articles from the databases in our university libraries so that people will not be relying on Dr. Rubin's data that has been published in their journal. Now, Pfizer is an example of a company that's had actions for fraud against the government, launched under the False Claims Act, and I have quite a bit to say about the False Claims Act as an important American reform. The total of its most recent 2009 penalties under the False Claims Act was a $2.3 billion payout by Pfizer. And it's not the only major pharmaceutical company that's had a penalty of more than $1 billion in recent years. And in recent years, most of the major American pharmaceutical companies have had penalties from False Claims Act cases of at least hundreds of millions of dollars. What was interesting about that 2009 case involving Pfizer is that Pfizer is such an important company with so many important and valuable products that the US government felt it was in a difficult position in meeting the legal obligations it has when you have a criminal conviction against a corporation as a result of that conviction to disqualify it from supplying the Medicare and Medicaid program. So what happened was that the government interpreted the perpetrator of the crime as not the Pfizer Corporation, but a Pfizer subsidiary, so that the Pfizer sort of owner of the subsidiary was not interpreted as the offender, so that Pfizer could continue to supply its products to the Medicare and Medicaid problem. Now here we have an interesting problem of corporate crime enforcement. With the global financial crisis, we saw the debate about these large banks being too big to fail. Pfizer was a case of a company that was too big to nail, couldn't afford to it was too important to disqualify from the Medicare, Medicaid program. So that there's a lot of power in the hands of these companies, and that's why corporate criminal enforcement is so often difficult. And that was the topic of that 2004 book as well. In the years after 2004, I should say, it was published, we finished the book in 1980, and it didn't come out till 1984 as a result of a large number of concerns by the publisher and threats by others about libel in relation to the book. But finally, it did come out, and no libel action was taken. I was told in Australia that the chief executives of all the companies were written to by the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association to see if there's something that could be nailed on Braithwaite in relation to some of the things that were said in the book, but they were unable to find a credible case of misrepresentation in the claims in the book. But in the years after corporate crime in the pharmaceutical industry, I became a kind of a friend of the industry, because I genuinely did come to the view that things were improving in the industry in the 1980s. There'd been a major consumer movement attack on misleading advertising claims relating to products that caused tens of thousands of deaths around the world, directed against the Swiss company Ciba-Geigy. And Ciba-Geigy responded to that campaign, of which I was a part during my days as a consumer advocate, by deciding to reform itself. And I think there was a genuine program of reform. The leadership of Ciba-Geigy came to talk to me, to ask people like myself who'd been critics of the industry what did they need to do to reform themselves. And they did a lot of things during the 1980s to improve the integrity of their marketing practices. Pfizer as well sent a senior vice president out to Australia to come and talk to me during the 80s, and I think in that period Pfizer and a number of the other leading companies had a lot of goodwill to improve its corporate image and to improve the integrity of its corporate practices. And I published work in the late 80s arguing that the pharmaceutical industry, corporate social responsibility was on the way up. I no longer think that. I think that period, that spring of corporate social responsibility in the pharmaceutical industry was a comparatively short spring. One of the things that happened from 1989 onwards, innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, if you look at the graph of innovation in the industry, it's going like that. At about 1989, it drops like that. The industry ran out of steam in terms of its innovative capabilities. And unfortunately, one of the things that happened then is that it tried to keep its profits up. It tried to keep those Wall Street analysts happy by, in many cases, returning to illegal and unethical practices to reach profit targets that it was no longer reaching, to coming up with major innovations that would actually improve health. So the bribery problem has not gone away, as I've already said. So the problem of fraud in the safety testing of drugs has not gone away. They might be a bit more sophisticated in how they do it than reincarnating rats these days. That audit might be detecting that a bit better today than in the past. But as in the case of Professor Rubin, we can see that fairly crude forms of fraud continue to persist and to mislead our drug regulatory authorities. Counterfeiting is a much bigger problem than it was at the time that we worked on corporate crime in the pharmaceutical industry. There are many developing countries today where even a majority of the drugs that are available on the market are counterfeited drugs, inert products fraudulently manufactured that will do nothing to improve your health, or even products that will be dangerous to your health because they don't have the molecular composition that's advertised that it's a counterfeit of. And that today is a really major threat to the health of poor people in developing countries who can't afford patented drugs. In the new book, we'll be arguing, using Australian data, that the loss in life from illegal conduct by pharmaceutical corporations is greater than the loss of life from criminal homicide in Australia. And there, of course, we're trying to say something about criminology. What's wrong with criminology that so much research gets done on homicide in the streets and so little gets done on homicide in the suites? Now, part of our argument about what the problem is here is that it's a problem of diffusion of responsibility within these organisations. These organisations are very good at creating smoke screens of diffused accountability for wrongdoing, such as that when criminal conduct occurs, it's possible for everyone in the organisation to say, it was him or it was her. Everyone's pointing to someone else. And it actually can be the case that lots of different corporate actors in different parts of the world are contributing to this pattern of corporate criminal conduct. When I did my research here in the United States in 1979 and 1980, I went to 3 companies where there were vice presidents who had very peculiar titles. And I said to people, and in 2 cases, I said to these vice presidents themselves, you have a very unusual title, quite unlike the title of other vice presidents in this company. What is really your job? And the answer was that they were the vice president responsible for going to jail. That is to say, lines of accountability were drawn in the organisation so that if someone had to take responsibility for some criminal conduct, it would not be the chief executive of the company, it would be the vice president responsible for going to jail. So the vice president responsible for going to jail was promoted to being a vice president on the basis that they would expose themselves to this risk for a period, and after a period of loyal service as the vice president responsible for going to jail, they would be promoted sideways into a safe vice presidency. The president of my university was so impressed with this idea when he read about it in our campus newsletter that he appointed a vice president for the first time and credited me with that. So that was one of my accomplishments as a professor at ANU. So scapegoating is a big problem. You know, when the criminal law does catch up with someone and someone does go to jail, unfortunately, it's often a scapegoat, a fall guy. And this is part of this general problem of diffused accountability, unclear accountability, which is partly inherent in the complexity of organisational life, but partly contrived into organisational life as a defensive mechanism. Another part of the complexity is what we call an international law evasion game. Now, transfer pricing, the use of tax havens. Tax havens are widely used by international pharmaceutical companies. So in many developed economies, major pharmaceutical companies pay no tax. You know, many major pharmaceutical companies are highly profitable in Australia, but pay no tax to the Australian government because, as we documented in the 1984 books with some of these major companies, they managed to organise their affairs so that all of their profits are located in a tax haven in the Caribbean, for example, or in other parts of the world. Now, that's part of an international law evasion game, but it was also part of an international law evasion game on the safety side. So a product would be put up for approval first in a country that had very low safety standards, very low standards of integrity in a checking, and a country where you could get the product marketed by bribing the health minister, get the product on the market, establish a place for it in the market in such a country, and then move on to another country that's a bit harder to get the product approved for marketing on the basis of some evidence that the product has gone quite well in this other country where it was marketed on the basis of a bribe. And so having a strategy for gradually rolling out the marketing across the world system. So the argument of the book that transnational corporations use transnational coherence and transnational systems against the transnational incoherence of national regulators, that the vision of national regulators is restricted to the national level of regulation, and that makes it quite difficult for them to be effective. Now, I'll come back to a proposed solution to that problem. So, multinational companies in the pharmaceutical industry have been very good at finding the line of least resistance against regulation through the world system, using their system against non-system. So what we've got is, this is a complexity argument as to why regulation and criminal enforcement is so difficult against multinational corporations. You've got complexity in the accounts, off-books accounts for the slush funds to pay bribes to foreigners. You've got complexity in the records, two types of records, one for legal purposes, one for illegal purposes. You've got jurisdictional complexity in the world system, and you've got organisational complexity. Now, our quantitative business school research colleagues, scholars such as Harlan Prechter now have done a lot of work showing that US corporations, which are more organisationally complex in terms of the number of subsidiaries they have, but the complex layering of hundreds of subsidiaries, allowing diffusion of responsibility among subsidiaries. The more complex those subsidiary structures are quantitatively, these are the companies that have more SEC fraud investigations against them. So we know a lot more about that problem of layers of complexity being a causal factor in both the perpetration of corporate crime and the difficulties in enforcing the law against it. So what do we do now that I've been proven wrong? What do we do now that criminal conduct, in my view, has not got better, as I thought in the 1980s, but actually worse? What do we do now that the pharmaceutical industry is associated with killing people at a level that is worse than the rates of murdering people with guns and other common means of violence, of crime on the streets? Well, the $2.3 billion false claims action against Pfizer last year in this country, I think, does begin to show a path forward, not so much because of the size of the penalty and the deterrent potential in that, but more for the detection capability that's been revealed through this reform, the False Claims Act. Now, in 1983, we argued, Brent Fissy and I argued for a revival of the idea of qui tam. Qui tam is a Latin term meaning short for he who sues on his own behalf, sues on behalf of the king. And there was a long history in English criminal law of private bounty hunters being able to get a proportion of the penalty, a proportion of the land that the king would seize from felons in return for capturing the felon and delivering the felon to the sheriff. Now, during the American Civil War, President Lincoln had huge problems of corporate crime affecting the Union Army, that the major European weapons manufacturers were ripping off the army. There were other kinds of rip-offs in the sale of donkeys that, I don't know what was wrong with the donkeys, but they couldn't walk, or they were very old or something, and weren't useful in the context of a war, and weapons that were defective and not working and so on. And in those days, the US state in Washington had no credible federal prosecutorial capability, especially with stretched wartime budgets. So he revived, through the False Claims Act in the 1860s, the possibility for private prosecutors to build the case against those who were ripping off the Union Army and get a percentage of the penalties that would be imposed on the arms manufacturer. Like earlier examples of privatised prosecutions, abuse set in fairly quickly. You know, that's what had happened in England centuries earlier, that bounty hunters would frame innocent people in order to get the bounty payoff, and various other abuses that you can imagine. But when the Republican senator from Iowa, Senator Grassley, a man of whom I'm a great fan, not only for his introduction of the False Claims Act into the US Congress, but for many other important corporate crime reforms that he has brought into this country. He brought in a False Claims Act in 1986 that had a genius in its design, a very simple reform to deal with the past corruption of private prosecutions. And that was the way the False Claims Act works. If there's an allegation of fraud against the US government, a whistleblower, and mainly these actions are launched by whistleblowers, the whistleblower can go to a law firm who specialises in False Claims Acts litigation. By the way, President Obama was a False Claims Act lawyer in Chicago before he went into politics, working in the health sector, actually. Very important case in this history that he was involved in. And persuade that law firm that this is a case from which it could succeed, it could prevail and make money. And then the False Claims Act lawyer takes the case, takes a file with the whistleblower's case against the company to the Justice Department, and the Justice Department examines it and says either, I think this is a good case, thank you. Privatisation of enforcement has worked here, because our problem has always been the inability to get inside knowledge about where the bodies are buried because of those layers of complexity that I've just explained. So the privatisation of enforcement, making whistleblower enforcement work in the future in a way that it has failed to work in the past through other measures such as whistleblower protection laws and so on. They really haven't worked. It's pretty dumb to be a whistleblower unless you can get a False Claims Act payout. So if the Justice Department says it likes the case that the False Claims Act lawyer working for the whistleblower has brought to it, it runs the case. And if it wins, with help from the whistleblower's lawyer, if it wins, the whistleblower will get around 25% of the penalty. It varies at the discretion of the judge, according to the judge's judgment of how much the whistleblower has contributed to the government having evidence that it did not have before, and it's affected by whether the whistleblower has some culpability, him or herself, in the fraud, and a number of other matters I won't go into, but that's the basic idea of the design. If, on the other hand, the Justice Department says, no, we believe you're a vexatious litigant, you have a grievance against your employer, and that's why you're blowing the whistle, we won't support you, we will not take this litigation forward, then the whistleblower, working with his law firm, has the right to say, okay, well, we will just launch the prosecution privately. We'll launch the civil litigation, privately under the False Claims Act. And if they win in those circumstances, they can get up to 35% of the penalty that goes to the government, so 65% of the penalty going to the government, 35%, up to 35% of the penalty going to the whistleblower. And of course, the Justice Department doesn't want that to happen. The Justice Department has an interest in getting it right, because the Justice Department will have egg on its face if the private litigator succeeds after the Justice Department has sent the case away. So it really keeps enforcement against large corporations on its toes in the Justice Department. On the other side of the ledger, if the Justice Department says, I don't think this is a meritorious case and we're not going to support it, that goes into the record when the private prosecution occurs. So if it really isn't a very meritorious case, it's very hard to win with the Justice Department saying, look, we looked at this judge and we don't support it. So that's what I call the genius, what Pamela Busey from the University of Alabama, the lead scholar in this area, calls the genius of the dual plaintiff design of the False Claims Act. So I regard this as a great American innovation, which has really only taken off in recent years in enforcement against major corporations. And very often in these major cases, as in the Pfizer cases, a civil case for fraud against the government leads on to a criminal case that the Justice Department launches as well. In these pharmaceutical cases, it usually leads on to a corporate integrity agreement as well, where the corporation agrees to a variety of measures to be a company with higher standards of integrity in future, to put in place better internal compliance systems against breach of the law, to discipline employees who have not behaved as responsibly or as vigilantly as they should have, to prevent the crime from occurring. Now, I've been very disappointed in the content of these US corporate integrity agreement. They've tended to become kind of templated, ritualistic thing. You know, tick these boxes and you'll be fine in terms of whereas, you know, I'm interested in the idea of restorative justice, whereas a restorative justice imagination would be about having a conversation with all the stakeholders about what it is we really need to do to restore integrity to the practices of this company. The Gulf Oil report that was done by senior counsel John J. McCloy in the 1970s has been a model for a lot of us who have been interested in corporate probation. That was a report that went public where Mr. McCloy really went through all of the problems of non-compliance with the law in relation to foreign bribery that the Gulf Oil Corporation had been engaging in around the world. And that's the kind of corporate integrity agreement that we should be hoping should be replicated in the current generation. But in that respect, enforcement standards have slipped back in my view as well. One of the things I once said to I've done some work with the Australian Taxation Office on fraud by multinational corporations against Australian taxpayers. And I said to a meeting of our major tax enforcers in Australia in 2001, just after the Enron scandal broke, I said to them, you know, you guys could have prevented the Enron scandal. They, of course, thought that I was mad. What could we here in Australia could have done to prevent the Enron collapse? Well, I said to them, there are two of you sitting in this room when I was doing my research in 1998 who said to me that partners of Arthur Andersen had come to them and said, look, we've had a major problem that has got this wealthy taxpayer into trouble with the law, but we want you to understand that this was a rogue partner. The other partners of Arthur Andersen really disapprove of what this other Arthur Andersen partner has done. And I said to them, that was your opportunity to organise a restorative justice conference in Australia with all of the partners of Arthur Andersen. Now, what's Arthur Andersen got to do with Enron? Well, Arthur Andersen was the auditor of Enron, was the auditor of WorldCom, and was also the auditor of some major Australian companies that had collapses in the same year, 2001, where shoddy and illegal accounting practices by Arthur Andersen were implicated in failing to do their job in revealing the fraud going on within those companies. So a criminal prosecution was launched against Arthur Andersen in this country, and as a result of the launch of that prosecution, Arthur Andersen collapsed. So my argument was that restorative justice could have been used preventively in Australia to lever a Gulf Oil Corporation kind of report into the worldwide unethical practices of Arthur Andersen as an organisation. So what would have happened, I argued to them, was that there would have been the restorative justice circle with all of the partners, and with the rogue partner that Arthur Andersen Australia was saying, we're going to take this person, this rogue partner, up to the top floor, and we're going to throw him off to the media below, and then everyone will be satisfied that we have cleaned up our act after this serious violation in Australia. So instead, my proposal was that the Australian Tax Office say, no, we'll sit round and we'll hear the rogue partner's story, and we'll hear supporters of the rogue partner defendants. A mentor who was resigned from Arthur Andersen years ago and mentored this alleged rogue partner. And my conjecture was that what the rogue partner would say and what the partner's mentor and other supporters from within Arthur Andersen would say, no, he is not a rogue partner. He is enacting the criminal corporate culture of Arthur Andersen as it was at that time. And the old hand, now retired from Arthur Andersen, would have been saying, this is not the way that Arthur Andersen conducted his business in my day. This is, and the way that Arthur Andersen was dealing with the accounts of a company like Enron was not the way that Arthur Andersen in previous generations had historically done its ethical work in this country. So that's the idea. Translating the same idea to the global financial crisis, you'll be surprised to learn now that I also think restorative justice could have prevented the global financial crisis, which I'm sure, like my tax office colleagues, you will also think is a ridiculous claim. So here's how. There was a lot of data around in this country about the surge in housing loan defaults. We've seen this data published in Criminology and Public Policy, that the FBI issued a press release in, was it 2004 or 2005, saying that there was a huge spike up in mortgage fraud in the United States. A lot of data that you can find in the contemporary US white-collar crime literature. So the preventive strategy from 2004, 2005 on, when this evidence of a spike in mortgage frauds, liar loans, where people who had low incomes were being recorded as having high incomes by banks and mortgage brokers, you would look at the data, and that data was there for regulators to use, and the regulator would go to a bank and say to the manager, look, we notice that your mortgage loans, your mortgage defaults have spiked up in the last year. And moreover, your mortgage defaults are 40% higher than the average for our state. Why is that? And then, the conversation in the circle about what's going on in your organisation, that you're issuing all of these loans to people that now all of a sudden are resulting on defaults of their housing loans. And as in the Gulf Oil report, that would have led to discovery of what we now know was that there was a systemic pattern of misrepresentation of the financial situation of lenders in the loan portfolios of those banks, and it was thinking that was fine as a prudential practice because it could then just slice and dice those loans, securitize the loans, and sell them on to other banks in other parts of the United States, in Europe, as securitized loans. So the United States moved into this pathological era where banks were not managing risks, but were shifting risks. And it was not in the long run interests of the banks, and a restorative justice conversation early on could have prevented those mortgage frauds from spinning out of control by regulators who managed to kick the tires, to sit in the circle with the management of those banks, to talk to them about what you're going to do to fix this problem of escalating mortgage defaults. So that's the restorative justice story that I'm wanting to put forward about prevention of the global financial crisis. Much earlier, here in the south of the United States, evidence, in 1990. So I'm going through, I'm not going to go back 200 years of American financial crises. I'll just go back to the three. There was a bank called BCCI that the CIA, among others, was finding useful to use because they were very good at money laundering and other nefarious activities, but they were also ripping off consumers all over the place. And evidence, they were owned, the bank was primarily controlled by the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi. And it operated through various subsidiaries in the south of the United States, and consumers were being ripped off in various ways, fraudulently. There was even a criminal prosecution and conviction against BCCI in the state of Florida. Now, again, my argument, now, the end of that story is that BCCI becomes the biggest collapse of the early 90s and creates considerable devastation in a couple of other countries, Abu Dhabi and in the United Kingdom, especially the latter. So my argument there as well was that if that Florida prosecutor had hired someone, had insisted on a John J. McCloy type report into BCCI, the devastation that BCCI caused as a bank in the United Kingdom and in the Middle East in the early, at the beginning of the 1990s might have been prevented. So that's a story there. Now, yesterday, a couple of the graduate students asked me if I could say something about BP and the Gulf and corporate crime, and I want to, and of course, I think that restorative justice could have prevented the great oil spill that you had here in the Gulf of Mexico. So how would I make that ridiculous claim? I'm famous for these ridiculous claims, by the way, so you can take them with a grain of salt, but I will nevertheless earnestly put it forward towards you. In 2000 and about 2009-10, about a year before your great oil spill in the Gulf, and I use the term great oil spill because, John J. McCloy's report into the Gulf oil bribery scandal was called the Great Oil Spill and became a New York Times top 10 bestseller in the 1970s. We had a major oil spill, which was almost as bad as yours, in the Timor Sea, in that sea north of Australia, between Australia and Indonesia, and the environmental devastation was massive. It went on for months, and couldn't be capped, just as yours couldn't. When our regulatory investigation occurred, it became clear that a major problem, which had it been fixed, could have prevented the oil spill occurring, was the concreting of the base of the deep sea oil well. And that concreting was done by none other than the Halliburton Corporation, the same company that did the defective concreting of the base of your Gulf of Mexico platform. So again, my argument is that if there had been a restorative, reparative process that was more forward-looking, and secondly, and here's the main point, more cosmopolitan about the obligations of the operators of that oil rig in the Timor Sea and its other corporations who are working to make that oil rig work, particularly Halliburton, had been required as part of an agreement that held over their head that, look, unless you produce a McCloy-style report that you make public internationally about how this oil spill was able to occur in the Timor Sea, we are going to allow whistleblowers to take, False Claims Act cases and so on. But if you undertake the Gulf oil type McCloy report style, high integrity, global investigation into your affairs internationally and what risks might also exist in other parts of the world, then we're not going to go ahead with the corporate criminal prosecution with the False Claims Act case. Now, of course, the problem is that our prosecutors, our regulatory agencies, don't have that international cosmopolitan view. The Australian offshore oil regulators were only focused on Australia's problem. We're not thinking about its international responsibility to ensure that something so terrible might happen to the environment of another company because of the same reasons as it indeed did within a matter of months in another country, to wit, the United States. So we need more of an ethic of cosmopolitanism among our law enforcers, among our corporate regulators. Maybe that needs some sort of international agreement to oblige our regulators to conduct investigations not only to the national problem but to the global problem when the corporations involved in the illegality are global corporations. If we don't do that in a world where national enforcement cannot work very effectively against transnational corporations returning to the pharmaceutical industry, we will bequeath to our children and our grandchildren a world in which more and more of them will be killed by dangerous drugs that are ineffective, that don't work, or that have very dangerous side effects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Braithwaite. We will now open the floor to questions from the audience. Once again, please raise your hand and stand and shout your question out at the top of your voices. Brenda.
You were publishing your book back in the early 1980s, and you had all of the pressure in the investigation and everything. Did you have to hire an attorney? And if so, did your university cover the cost of the attorney, or did you have to hire one on your own dime?
John, please restate the question.
The question was, when I had those problems between 1980 and 1984 with worries about libel in my book, Corporate Crime in the Pharmaceutical Industry, did my university assist me with providing a lawyer? Answer, no. I was fortunate enough to have a brother-in-law who was a lawyer, and he helped me. But most of the legal work was done by my publisher's lawyer. I would have to say that legal work was not a benefit to me, because the publisher's lawyer was incredibly conservative, wrote to me with somewhere between 300 and 400 questions that I was required to answer. That he was a London lawyer, that he was not satisfied, that I was not putting Routledge and Kagan Paul, the publisher, at risk. It was a hard time.
Good morning. I have a question actually on behalf of my colleague, Matt Nobles. Dr. Nobles is under the weather, and so he is relegated to writing his question down because he gets lost his voice. So this question is actually Dr. Nobles' question. Can you please discuss the recent trend emphasizing direct marketing of pharmaceuticals to consumers? Aside from the obvious economic implications, how has this practice marginalized healthcare providers and facilitated corporate misconduct? Also, to what extent is this an international legal regulatory issue? Thank you.
The question was asked on behalf of Dr. Matt Nobles, and it is about the increase in the direct marketing of pharmaceuticals, and is that a growing problem, and what can be done about it? I guess it is a growing problem in this country, but this country is unusual. To my knowledge, there are only 2 countries in the developed world that allow direct marketing of pharmaceuticals to consumers, and those 2 countries are the United States and New Zealand. So in other countries like Australia, throughout Europe, Japan and so on, you don't turn on your television set and see pharmaceutical products that require a prescription. If they're a prescription drug, in most countries they are not allowed to be advertised in the mass media. And I think that's a good policy. Pharmaceuticals might be legal products, but they are tamed poisons. You know, there was a time in this country, not so many decades ago, when both cocaine and heroin were legal drugs that were widely marketed by pharmaceutical companies in this country. Pharmaceutical products need to be viewed as dangerous drugs that can potentially do great good and potentially do great harm. So it is not, mass marketing in the media is not the appropriate venue for it. In my view, there's been a very effective corporate lobby in this country, and there was in New Zealand, for allowing mass marketing of drugs, and I think that's a great political mistake. It's also one of the things that has put up your health costs to be so much higher health costs than other developed economies have to deal with. So it also makes economic sense in a period of budgetary restraint to get down your Medicare, Medicaid costs by stopping marketing of products that are not necessarily the best way to decide what tamed poison to put into your body is in a conversation with your doctor, not in a conversation with a Madison Avenue marketing agency.
Questions?
Talk a little bit more about the dismal state of criminology with respect to white-collar crime and what the types of crimes and the types of issues that were most likely to study?
Well, I think,
Restate the question. I'm sorry.
yeah, the question is, comment on what's the dismal state of criminology with regard to white-collar crime and what my comment would be on that. It is a problem. In these things, I think we have to look at the glass half full as half empty. And in this, I think that US leadership has been a very positive thing. The most important scholar of white-collar crime has been Edwin Sutherland. And he had a major influence on American criminology, probably the most influential American criminologist that there has been. He created the term white-collar crime. The term white-collar crime did not exist in the English language until Edwin Sutherland from the University of Indiana invented it for his presidential address to the American Society of Criminology in 1949, I think. That was a great phase. You know, you had great American criminologists like Donald Cressy and Gilbert Geiss following in Sutherland's footsteps in the 1950s and 1960s, and Marshall Clinard. Then after Watergate, you had another wonderful resurgence of white-collar crime scholarships in the US Criminological Academy. Indeed, in the 1970s, you saw most of the very best American criminologists turning their hand to the study of white-collar crime. That was the era in which I got interested in white-collar crime as a result of the influence of the leadership of the Criminological Academy in this country. I won't go through the list of them because it really is, you know, from Simon Dinitz, your mentor, Dennis, to my mentor, Gil Geiss, to Marshall Clinard, to Al Rees at Yale. There's such a long list of the greatest luminaries of the field of that era who worked in the 80s, 90s, and in the last decade. That interest gradually drifted away, and there's not the acknowledgement that there should be that corporate crime involves greater losses of property and losses of life than crime in the streets. But hopefully, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, that might have the same effect on criminology and on American leadership in this field, which has been wonderful leadership across the decades that we saw in the aftermath of Watergate. That's at least my hope.
I'd like to ask you a question. How can doctors cure illnesses if they are so confused by the effects of the unnecessary additives in medicines? Because you buy, one of the medicines you buy, usually what it contains this effect plus all these additives. Then you look to see the side effects of the additives. And you see that this person is not trying to cure you. This person is trying to create a new illness in you. So I see doctors so confused. And that is the problem of the corporations, the pharmaceutical corporations, that they are telling the doctor, use my product. And if you use my product, you can have a trip to Europe. And all these things is a complete corruption. So what is the answer when you buy a medicine and you see it contains more ingredients than the real one you are buying?
Yes, that is a problem. The problem is being raised in the question is how can doctors cope with the complexity of there being so many complex interactions with different ingredients and different products being consumed by the same patients, and with the information that doctors are bombarded with from sales representatives offering them trips to Europe or golf balls or whatever they're giving to doctors in this country at the moment. That is a problem. I think there are people in the medical profession fighting back against that problem. I mean, one of those very positive things that happened in the 1980s that I didn't talk about was the formation of the Medical Lobby for Appropriate Marketing, which was doctors communicating with each other and writing in letter writing campaigns from doctors who are, after all, as you say, the front line of their marketing, say, look, you're confusing us with the information you're providing on this product. You are not giving the information we need to protect the safety of our patients. And that was a very positive form of reintegrative shaming of the pharmaceutical companies from the medical profession itself. That goes on today, and I think that's an important part of the positive story about a web of controls that can solve this problems. But we also need the medical journals to seize the agenda and provide the digestible meta-analyses so we can get back to a world where doctors are relying more on the scientific information in the journals, digested for them in a more readable way than the most sophisticated bits of empirical work, boiled down to simple, high-quality communication from the medical journals. That medical journal leadership, I think, is a very important part of the problem, so that the doctors will turn away from the information that is marketed to them in misleading ways and toward more scientific forms of communication.
Thank you.
Do you think that, for the power players or the elites of these pharmaceutical companies or different forms and such, what do you think that research would be enough to gain their attention for them to actually stop before some sort of problem would occur? And if not, what do you think it will take for it to gain their attention when power players are making money in that reality then, rather than projections for the future? Or do you think it's going to need a whole justice reform?
The question is just providing more information enough when you have powerful elites in major multinational companies who are making a lot of money out of misrepresentation? My answer is it's not enough. But to be effective against corporate crime, what you need is a web of controls, a web of influences. Any single strategy standing on its own will not prove effective. You need a web of interacting strategies. Secondly, I want to make a point about the powerful elites. In every pharmaceutical company in which I've done research, and I've done research in all of the major ones where I've interviewed people, there are highly ethical, highly socially responsible people to be found. So you also need strategies that strengthen the hand of the ethical insiders. And that's why I think the kind of whistleblowing reforms in the False Claims Act are a good thing, and having the threat of False Claims Act litigation hanging over the head that the company can avoid by listening to its socially responsible internal voices that say, look, we have a problem, we're going to be hit in the courts with hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties. We are doing the wrong thing. Let us step forward and go to the Food and Drug Administration and ask for a restorative justice conference to talk about what we can do to right the wrongs of our past, to put in place better compliance systems for the future to compensate the victims of our wrongdoing in return for agreement from the government not to proceed with the prosecution. But if they fail to do that, to have serious prosecutorial capability that will target both the corporations and those powerful individuals who at the moment lie behind smoke screens of diffused accountability. But you see, getting the conversation right internally within the corporation, strengthening the hand of the many, many socially responsible actors within the pharmaceutical industry, to me, is the right way to go, because they will respond to that opportunity. We shouldn't make the mistake of stigmatising pharmaceutical companies as criminal from top to bottom. What they have is a mixture of ruthless executives and socially responsible executives. So we need a web of control that empowers the socially responsible voices.
Thank you. I'm sure, follow up?
Are they regularly exposed to research of that manner, or would it have to be done?
Say again.
Are they
Are they
regularly?
exposed to the research that suggests that problems becoming, or is that part of their kind of regular procedure, or is it something that can be easily occurring and we just finding those radar?
I didn't hear all of it, but I think the question is, are those socially responsible insiders regularly exposed to the research that shows what the problems are? And I think that is one of the problems, that the more nefarious executives within corporations sometimes do conspire to keep evidence about the socially irresponsible effects of their corporations away from the good guys within their own organisations. So the good guys within their own organisation won't become whistleblowers, so they won't put them under a kind of pressure which will mean that they will achieve lower bonuses in the next year. So the bonus culture is again part of the problem here, just as it was with the global financial crisis.
Out of respect for Doctors Franklin and Zhao, I'm sorry, Courtney, you were almost Dr. Courtney. I'm going to stop the questions now. Doctoral students will be able to continue later, but it's the time for class changes, and so that's why people have been getting up. I thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you again, Dr. Braithwaite.